Hi, I'm Julie. I'm back with a New Year's Eve nibble that I think you'll enjoy. I'm making savory little pâte choux or cabbage pastry puffs. And why is it called cabbage pastry, you might ask? Because when they puff up, they look like little cabbages, or so the story goes. At any rate, I love this recipe because it does double duty, and I love things that serve multiple purposes because it always saves time at the end of the day. It works really well both in a sweet compilation, like in the classic sweet cream puff or eclair, but it also works really well with savory items. As you'll see here, we're pairing ours with smoked salmon, a little bit of horseradish mousse, the recipe which you'll find on my website, and a little bit of caviar to make it extra special for New Year's Eve. And I like serving them in these little salt cellar dishes because they just look so dainty and lovely that way. Now, as simple as this recipe is, it's only 4 ingredients. There are some tricks to making sure you get the maximum puff out of the dough, and that starts with actually prepping the cookie sheets properly, the baking sheets. I'm making appetizer sized puffs, so I want them only piped about 1 inch wide, and they'll expand to about double in size and height, certainly, and about to 1/4 to 1.5 inch width. So you could draw a template for yourself if you're not a great piper. These are just 1-inch circles drawn here. If you're going to do that and use that as a piping guide, just make sure you turn it over so the pen doesn't bleed into the dough, which it will when it bakes. But I'm not going to use that. I'm simply going to bake on my silicone baking mat. If you don't have a silicone baking mat, grease your cookie sheet thoroughly in order to ensure that the puffs come off, but you won't need to grease the silicone baking mat. In any event, whether you use a greased cookie sheet, one line with a silicone baking mat, or one line with parchment paper, you do want to rinse the cookie sheet. And by rinsing it, I mean just sprinkle on some cold water. Usually I do this over a sink here. And then I just want to get a little bit everywhere on the cookie sheet. And then I just want to sort of, I'm dumping that into a garbage can I've got down there, normally into the sink. You just want to pour off the excess so you're just left with tiny little droplets all over the top. Why would you do that? It's an absolute necessity, really, if you're piping directly on the metal, because these bake at a very high temperature, about 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's quite possible that they'll scorch on the bottom if you don't rinse the sheet before they bake all the way through and before they get suitably puffy. So you want to make sure you do that. It's probably less necessary to do it on a silicone baking mat because this sort of encourages the product to bake more evenly. But I do it even so because rumor has it that that extra bit of evaporation of this moisture lends a little bit more puff to the puffs, the final puffs. So rinse your baking sheets. I'm going to head on over to the stove. The rest of the process is done, well, the first part of the process is done in the stove before these even go in the oven. 4 ingredients, and it's really pretty quick. So I'm going to move over there and show you how to do it. Okay, so I'm over here at the stove, and I've got 2 of my 4 ingredients. This is actually 4 ingredients plus salt. I've got a cup of water and 1/2 cup of butter, unsalted, in the pan, and I've cut it up into small chunks just to accelerate the process here because you want to bring this over medium-high heat to a rolling boil. And if you put the big stick in there, it'll take a little bit longer to come to a boil. I'm going to add 3/4 teaspoon of salt as well here. If you're doing the sweet version of this recipe, I knock that down to 1/2 teaspoon because I find it's otherwise a little bit too salty. Okay, it's at the rolling boil, and at this point, I could wait for it to break a little bit more in the center. We're going to do that. And then we want to remove it from the heat and quickly and immediately add, I'm going to move it over here to this side, and quickly and immediately add the 1 cup of pre-sifted flour that I have. And I'm going to stir it up until all that water is absorbed. And the reason I want to add all the flour at once at the rolling boil is because the flour will have more absorptive properties at that stage. It'll be able to take up more of the water. And the reason that's important is because the drier this mixture is to start, the more eggs I can incorporate later. And it's the 4 eggs I'm adding later that are the primary leavener. So the more moisture I can deplete from this, the more eggs I can incorporate in the greater puff I'll get on these puffs. Looks like mashed potatoes now, doesn't it? That's how it should look. I just want to get any lumps of flour out. Then we're going to move it back to the heat, turn this down to about medium-high, and I'm going to dry this. By that, I'm going to try to extract more moisture from it over medium-high heat by stirring pretty regularly. It doesn't have to be constantly, but I want to stir often enough that I don't scorch the dough at all. But I'm drying it out again to take out moisture so I can get more eggs in the end. So we're just going to continue here for 7 to 10 minutes drying this out. What you're looking for at the end state is, it won't look altogether much different, except that you'll notice a little bit more glisten. This won't be such a matte finish. There'll be a little glisten of melted butter sort of coming to the surface there. So we're just going to continue here, and I'll pull that when the time comes, and we'll add the eggs. Okay, so I dried this for 5 to 7 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and let it cool additionally about a couple of minutes only while stirring to accelerate the cooling process. I'm going to be adding 4 eggs one at a time, but I don't want to add them while this is super duper hot because I'll cook the eggs, and if you cook the eggs, then you lose the leavening power of the eggs. So I've cooled it down slightly just to accommodate the first egg, and I add them gradually because, as you'll see if you were to add them all at once, stirring constantly as I add them because the residual heat here could still cook the eggs. But if I keep it moving, I'm less likely to do that. I'm going to move these out of the way, and you'll see it starts out very kind of sloppy and lumpy looking, but as I stir more aggressively, it'll come back together and almost look like how I started. And that's sort of how you want to add, that's definitely how you want to add each egg. One at a time, it'll start looking soupy, but bring it back to the consistency it once was before you proceed to add the next one. Otherwise, you'll just have a hard time incorporating all the eggs, and you need all the eggs to give it all that leavening power. Okay, and I've got my 4th egg in. Again, I'm doing this all off the heat, though I'm sitting on a burner. The burner is not on because you don't want to cook your eggs. It's all in, and this is the end consistency you're looking for. Is kind of this thick paste. It's going to cling to my wooden spoon. And you want to pipe this pretty immediately once it's done because it can crust and become thicker and harder to pipe. Okay, back to my piping station. And as noted before, you want to move pretty quickly with this so it doesn't crust and get too thick. I'm just going to load a pastry. So I have more control in terms of the size. I like to pipe this through a pastry bag. You could dollop it with a spoon, but it gets pretty messy. And I've just got my pastry bag fitted with a coupler, no tip, just a coupler. That's a perfect size for doing these 1-inch puffs. So you want to pipe them about 1 inch, and that looks pretty good, and about 2 inches apart, because believe it or not, as small as they look, they are going to probably double in size. Maybe not spread so much, but certainly gain a lot of height. I'm just going to pipe half a tray. You'll notice that the dough is really thick enough that it leaves a little peak. And if you were to leave that there, you'd have a little peak to your cream puff, which we don't really want. So I'm going to come back and give these an egg wash. And in the process of giving them an egg wash, I'm going to be able to knock that peak down. My egg wash is simply a bit of egg and milk, and I've got the recipe on my website again. The other purpose of the egg wash is it promotes the browning of the top of the cream puff, and it gives us a nice little sheen and a little darker brown hue than it would normally get. And I'm using a small brush because these are so tiny just to paint it on. You want to make sure the egg wash doesn't actually hit the cookie sheet, because if you put a lot on it, it drains down there. It can bake onto the cookie sheet and prevent the rise of that puff. You know, it'll harden before the puff actually gets a full rise. So I'm just kind of going over the top, and that's why I'm using partly such a small brush. In the process, I can knock down, once it's wet, I can knock down the top. If I try to knock down the top when my finger is dry and the puff is dry, and it doesn't really knock down. So either your finger has to be damp, or you have to spread a little glaze on it, egg wash on it first before you can knock that down. These will go into a 400 to 425 degree oven. I run it at 400 all the way through for about 20 to 25 minutes, and about 5 minutes from the time that they're close to being done, I like to pierce the side with a trussing needle or with the end of a thermometer in this case, and that'll create a little hole that'll allow some hot air to get in and dry out the interior of the puff. If you don't do that, the puffs won't collapse, but they'll have a little bit more doughy moisture on the inside, and I tend not to like that. Before I put these in the oven, though, I did want to bring over a few comparison points just so you can see how much they actually do puff up. These are exactly the same size puffs, fully baked, and you'll see that nice little brown sheen that they have on top as a result of the egg wash. Okay, so off they come, and I'll put those in the oven, and we'll come back and fill a few and have a little sample before New Year's. Okay, I've got some finished cream puffs. They're totally cooled down now after having been 20-25 minutes in a 400 degree oven. You don't want to fill them while they're warm or they'll get soggy. You can make these ahead and then contain them, but they do sog out if they're in an airtight container. They get a little soft. So if you want them crispy, I recommend putting them back in the 400 degree oven before you're ready to fill them. Get them crisped up, let them cool down to room temp, and then go ahead and fill them. So you can restore that crispness just by drying them in the oven a little bit. Now to fill them, because I punctured a hole in them, I don't have a lot of doughy interior, which is super. So I can just cut them in half and fill them with whatever I want to fill them with. But as I said, I have this little horseradish mousse, which I'm actually going to start. You can do this in any which order, but I've got little pieces of smoked salmon here. I'm just going to topple some in. I like to overfill them so they look kind of puffy and generous. going to put a little of my horseradish mousse on top. No appetizer is complete without caviar on New Year's Eve. This is salmon roe, actually, the big red eggs. A springlet of dill just to give it a little touch of color. And top it off. There you have it, a sexy little appetizer for New Year's. Happy New Year's. Live sweetly.